Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for getting up and being present so early in the morning after our fabulous ALPSP conference dinner last night. I hope everybody enjoyed the quiz and weren't too traumatized by Richard's always interesting questions. So our speaker this morning is Professor Graham Crowe, who has come down from the University of Edinburgh to talk to us about his work in the research ethics field, but research ethics for social sciences. So Graham is Professor of Sociology and Methodology at the University of Edinburgh, as I said, and he's a co-investigator in the National Centre for Research Methods funded by the UK ESRC. He's got quite a lot of experience as an editor of various journals, so he knows our field as well as his own, and he's on the Publications Committee for the Academy of Social Sciences. I asked Graham to come talk to us about research ethics outside of the STM field because of last year's feedback that we needed to expand the remit of this conference a little bit beyond STM. So I hope that you enjoy the talk. I have seen the slides. They're very interesting. Graham.
Great, thank you, Tasha. And yes, I can confirm that this won't be an STM talk, but I'll try and make the examples that I give and the cases we look at of general interest. Just to begin with, this is the title that's in the programme. This is the title that I supplied. I can see why the programme made it revise what I supplied, because this does look rather dull with hindsight. 10 frequently encountered questions and why they matter. But it does pass the Ronseal test in that that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 10 frequently encountered issues that I found come up in my work in relation to journals, in relation to research ethics committees, and also in relation to supervising students and discussing with colleagues about ethical issues in research matters. And I'll be referring at one point to a project I was involved with about anonymity and confidentiality. I understand the slides will be available afterwards, so if I rush through, please bear with me. That will mean we'll have more time for questions and general discussion. But I'll go through each of the 10, which are listed here, and make the argument that this is not an exhaustive list. So certainly there are many dubious practices, there are many issues beyond these 10, but these, I think, will give a flavour of what, at least in social sciences, we tend to encounter quite frequently as issues. And if I have a general message, it's that it's good for these things to be out there and discussed, to be put into publications and to have discussion around them. Because if there's a word that comes up frequently when I talk about ethics, it's that people say, yes, after your talk I realised that is quite tricky, isn't it? So my sense is that there's not enough discussion, not enough kind of engagement with these issues. Maybe that also is indicating that there aren't simple answers, but I'll try and go through these 10 particular issues and see where that takes us in terms of giving a sense of the range of ethical challenges and issues that are faced. So I start with anonymity and confidentiality. I'm running those two things together because they're often treated together, although they are two separate things. And basically, anonymity is important as an ethical issue because people don't necessarily want to be identified if they've taken part in research, and quite often people are given pseudonyms. Sometimes they're even asked to choose their own pseudonym. And confidentiality is that people don't necessarily want everything that they say to a researcher or reveal to a researcher in the research process. They don't want everything to be then reproduced, put into the public domain. And it's a very common thing to find after an interview's been completed and the recording device is switched off, people then say, oh, I'm glad that's off. So in confidence, I can now tell you this. And that is not intended for wider consumption, but I think it's something that researchers do struggle with in terms of that's often the best bits from the research process, but it's important that is respected. And there's more to anonymization than simply giving people a pseudonym. There's a classic study from the 1950s in the United States where a community was researched, and they gave the community a pseudonym, Springdale, and they then talked about the school principal, and not in particularly flattering terms. They were also not particularly flattering the researchers about the community, so much so that they have the dubious distinction of being the only researchers who've ever been hanged in effigy, which in the town carnival, because they had gone in and said, well, you know, we want to study you, we think this is a great place to live, how lucky you are, and we want to tell the world about you. And then in the report, they talked much more about how the people there were rather provincial, had rather narrow-minded views, and not unsurprisingly, the people of Springdale took against them. And as part of that project, one of the things was that you can give a location a pseudonym. You can just say that it's the principal. But if the people involved in the project knew the research was going on, which they did, the people in the town, then they didn't need the principal to be named to know who he was. So that is referred to a lot in the ethics literature as how not to do things, or one example of how not to do things. I'll come to others as well. And regarding confidentiality, it's really just a point that it's important to reflect on what you've collected in terms of research data, because it may well be that people tell you things that they don't realize the consequences of making those things public. And in a lot of social science research, people strike up friendships between researchers and researched, and as people relax, they can be more free with information than, with hindsight, it turns out to be a good idea that they were. Once something's in the public domain, then of course it's very hard to take back. This is a social network map, which is even older than I am. This is a study done in Wales in the 1940s, published in the early 1950s. And the lines, you can see it's old if you look closely, because it's drawn with a pencil and ruler, and the dots. The dots represent households, and the lines represent kinship connections. So this is a small parish in North Wales in the 1940s, and it's showing who's related to whom. You might think that's fairly innocuous, and I mean, it's certainly very interesting, because there are one or two households that aren't related to anyone else in the parish, but there are others who seem to be related to just about everybody. And once that information is in the public domain, then you can tell from the geographical location and the other points of connection who's related to whom. And with hindsight, that may not be something that everybody would be happy for people to know. So I particularly like this map. I also like it because local kinship connections, the researcher Alwyn Rees reported, were so thick that they were described in a local saying as like a pig's entrails. So if you look at this in a particular way, this is something that should resemble a pig's entrails. So anonymity and confidentiality, generally important, but particularly important in relation to the treatment of vulnerable people. And sometimes there are people who are identified as vulnerable groups of people, such as people with learning difficulties or children, where it's important in the research process that parents or other people who have a responsibility also give their consent to these people being involved in research. But that can be quite tricky, and this word tricky came up a lot in this particular research project that was led by Rose Wiles, and I was part of that team. One example that came up, we did some focus groups with people, so we're talking here to other researchers about how they found anonymity and confidentiality something of a challenge. And I particularly like this one because one really feels for this child. So it's a child who, to take part in the research in the school with the researchers, needed to have a signed form from his parents, and he really wanted to be part of the research, so much so that he forged his parents' signature on the form. And the teacher was wise to this, and the poor child couldn't take part in the research because the teacher is here saying, you know, it has to be a proper signature before you can take part. So I hope he wasn't scarred for life, but it certainly is kind of an interesting issue. And when I've presented this in various other contexts, Some people have said, oh, I'd have let him in. So there are clearly different views about how to handle that process of people who want to be involved but don't have the consent. The opposite is in relation to a piece of prison research where someone thought he had the participants' consent, but then quite quickly into the process of the research, it was clear that the authorities have said, this will be good for you if you take part in this research. And so that led to his discontinuing being involved in that particular research process. We came across lots and lots of cases talking to other researchers about the challenges that they faced. Those are just two from a much larger body of material. Third issue, privacy and data security. I guess for this audience, I don't really need to say much more than data security is an important part of privacy, and it extends beyond people having the right not to answer any particular questions that they'd prefer not to. One issue that comes up is if you are interviewing people, quite often they'll say, well, it's easiest if I'm interviewed in my home, so you're invited into their home, you conduct the interview, but you're also taking stock of the environment, the nature of the home, the nature of the furnishings, the nature of the books on the bookshelves and that sort of thing. And it can be tempting to reveal more than comes across from the participants through their interviews. And I can talk more about that in questions if people would like. And ethnographic researchers who are out and about and not necessarily making it fully clear to people around them that they're researchers may also raise some interesting questions. This next one is, this next example of that is from a piece of research that was done on the Isle of Sheppey. Anybody here been to the Isle of Sheppey apart from me? Oh, very good. Let's talk after. And in this, so this is where the dot is here. It's near to Boris Island, if that ever gets off the ground. But it would be a bad idea because of a Second World War wreck, which is full of unexploded TNT. Anyway, Sheppey is a very interesting place, and the researcher who did this, Ray Powell, went there and spent the best part of a decade using a range of methods, but including ethnographic observation. And in his book, Divisions of Labour, he had the following description. A small elite of red-faced men with large stomachs, large fords, and tinsley wives with long fingernails patronise the player cub on Minster cliffs and drink many gins before their steak or scampi and chips. I know this study very well, and I know that when it was published, it didn't go down terribly well locally. And I also know, Ray is no longer with us, sadly, but I also know that the book was written in a bit of a hurry. And I think if this had been passed by a few more sets of eyes, people may have kind of suggested perhaps take this bit out because it's not necessarily going to make you popular locally. There's also an issue about privacy and keeping data secure. And in one of my roles, I have the task with others of looking at research proposals where the funding has been approved, but the ethics has to be scrutinized. And I'm constantly amazed at how people can be quite cavalier about researcher safety and the safety of their data in research being undertaken in conflict zones, for example. So certainly there are many fieldwork settings where we have to think about, are my data going to be secure? Is my recording device going to be taken off me by someone with a large knife? And that then leads me on to the fourth point. Some of you will know Bill Bryson's book about his trek up the Appalachian Trail, A Walk in the Woods. And I use this when I speak to students before, and indeed other researchers before they go into the field, because I think it's a good maxim. Researcher safety is not always taken into account as an ethical issue, but I think there are ethics for certainly people planning research projects where they're sending researchers where there is the possibility, no more than that, of danger. And Bryson's account is one that I think provides us with a very good way of looking at things. So he's in this, early on in the book, he's preparing for the trip up the Appalachian Trail in the eastern United States, and discovers that there are bears on the Appalachian Trail, and that bear attacks can be fatal. This throws him to a bit of a panic, and his partner tries to reassure him and says, oh, it's very unlikely, and it's 1 in a million. And he says, I couldn't get the idea out of my head. Once would be enough. And I think that's a very good way to get people to think about some of the issues around researcher safety. And indeed, they have my former Southampton colleagues, Liz Kenyon and Sheila Hawker, used that as the title of an article about, in this case, lone researchers. So this was research being conducted in the UK, but it was around about the time that Susie Lamplugh had gone missing, the estate agent who disappeared, showing a client on her own around a house, and researchers may find themselves in similar sorts of risky situations. So I want just really to sort of flag this up here, that certainly in conflict zones, researcher safety is an important issue, but not only conflict zones. Taking sides is a really big issue in ethics, as you'll be aware, but particularly in social science, where lots of social science wear the badge of being critical with pride. They say, I'm not just a realist thinker, I'm a critical realist, or I'm not just a social scientist, I'm a critical social science. And that is in some ways appropriate. What they're doing is they're flagging up where they're coming from in terms of their own political standpoints, and there is the argument that you can never divorce the research process in social science entirely from your own particular political and ethical standpoints. But there is another position, and this is one that I hold, which is that it's important to aspire to being ethically neutral and to keep science and politics separate. And if there were other social scientists here, we could talk about this all day, and I would probably be pilloried because I'm in a minority on this point currently. But stretching back over the history of social science, this has been an issue about how do we relate our own personal politics to the things that we're studying. So my own view is that it's important certainly to flag up where we're coming from, and if we are going to be taking sides, we should do this as explicitly, openly, and clearly as possible. But there is a rival position, which is this one that it's quite appropriate and indeed inevitable to indicate whose side we're on. Now, this is complicated. I mean, it's complicated in and of itself, and there's a famous article that I've put down here by Howard Becker, who was a researcher who made his name in drugs research and deviance. And his article is incredibly cited, and one of the reasons why it's cited is because you can find support for a range of different points of view in that article. So people cite him saying, well, of course, I agree with Becker, and you get people who have diametrically opposed positions, both saying, well, of course, Becker supports my point of view. So it is tricky anyway, but I think it's further tricky with the movement towards collaborative research and co-production and so on, where there is an expectation on the part of many partner groups. I work in the field of community, and community groups will very often have an expectation that the research will be of benefit of them and will be positive in its portrayal. And thinking back to the Springdale account and thinking back to the Sheppey account, those are examples where community members have responded negatively to what they take to be critical accounts of their communities. So it's important in that respect, and it also is important the more we find researchers working with partner organisations, community groups, and indeed individuals, the more we find issues coming up about who owns the data and there isn't one answer to this, but I think there is a very clear lesson to be learned that it's very good to avoid any ambiguity. It's very good to be clear from the outset about who owns the data and the use to which the data collected may well be put. And sometimes that can make things difficult to publish, as I'm sure many of you know, and sometimes lawyers need to get involved. But if you can avoid that, no offence to any lawyers present, but if that can be avoided, then that's desirable. I'm not going to read, this is a book by Alice Goffman. Just out of interest, have any of you picked up on this controversy about Alice Goffman? One of you, that's excellent. We can also talk after. Alice Goffman's book came out in 2014. It's about life amongst young black men in inner city Philadelphia. And it caused a great deal of controversy because Alice Goffman is a white, more privileged researcher, and there are all sorts of dimensions to the debate about it. But essentially, what I'm picking this out for here is that it was seen as inappropriate for a privileged white woman to go and help her career by gathering data from disadvantaged young black men who are on the run, often involved in problematic relationships with law enforcement. And that's an interesting question, dimension about the question of taking sides in research. Do you have to be of a community to research that community? And some of the responses to this study have been along those lines. There may just be an element of academic jealousy here. Alice Goffman, as some of you may know, was the daughter of Irving Goffman, who is one of the most published social scientists ever. And I guess some fellow sociologists may have looked and said, well, that's not fair. She's had a head start in her career. Let's say something horrible about her. Anyway, but it has been controversial, and I mentioned that in the context of this issue of taking sides. Inducement is another tricky issue. Should we compensate our research participants for taking part in research in some way? Should they be paid, or should they be compensated in some other way? It comes up a lot, and some people say, well, the ethical thing is, of course, to pay people for their time and their trouble, their travelling expenses, and so on, or if they're part of a laboratory experiment for their time and any risk involved there. But there are other researchers, and some research ethics committees debate this extensively, where they say, well, of course, if you're paying people, then maybe that's inducement. Maybe that's kind of getting people to do things that they don't really want to do. They're just doing it for their money. And so once you get into this situation, there is, first of all, the principle of whether you do compensate people by money, and then secondly, how much. And I've certainly been part of very long discussions about how much it's appropriate to pay people for participation. Some people say, well, we should pay them at the same rate as professors pay, because then it's equal. And I say, have you checked that with the research councils who are funding the project? Not that professors are overpaid or anything, but it's an issue. This is, sorry, much too small. I was trying to capture this screenshot from the University of Leicester, just as an example that there are lots and lots of resources available for thinking about inducement. And again, when I've done this presentation in various contexts, people have sort of said, oh, I hadn't really thought about that as inducement. So this is there saying it's not just about money, it can also be inducement if you offer participants things like cigarettes or sweets. And if you're going to do it, give people money rather than things that are bad for them. Overpromising is number 7. This can be a type of inducement in a way, and I'm guilty of it. Certainly when I started out my academic career in my PhD, I was studying the Common Agricultural Policy, and this was back in a time when the UK had just recently joined the European Economic Community, and people said, when I asked them if I could interview them, they said, well, what's the point of that? And I said, well, I'll collect lots of material, I'll write it up as a thesis, it'll get published as articles, politicians will take notice of it, and they'll change the common agricultural policy. And I look back and think that was probably quite serious overpromising, because although some things did get published from the research, I don't think it ever reached the committees that decide on the operation of the common agricultural policy. So I've learned to rein in my enthusiasm for identifying what may come from involvement in the research. And it's good to be clear to research participants too that they may not like the results. So sometimes there's an assumption that if people are being researched, that it'll be good for them or good for their community, that good things will follow. And that doesn't necessarily follow. There are lots of examples where research can end up undermining the self-image or the claims that are made by particular groups. And as I say, for research to have an impact on policy is a much harder task than I thought when I was 21, despite all the talk that there is nowadays about evidence-based practice. And that's also complicated. I was part of a research excellence framework webinar on Wednesday, and Jane Miller, the chair of Main Panel C, for those of you who follow these things, was saying that impact can also be preventing change. So sometimes research stops bad things from happening, stops a policy innovation that's misguided. How exactly you establish that, I don't know. But anyway, the point is that it's all too easy when people say, what's in it for me to take part in this, to exaggerate the likely results. And certainly to exaggerate the speed with which any benefits may follow. So sorry about the darkness of the slide. One of my PhD students has been involved in going back to a project in the 1970s when the Home Office, so this was before Scottish devolution, the Home Office in Whitehall initiated 12 community development projects, and the one in Scotland was in Fergusley Park in Paisley. And that was chosen because of the concentration of deprivation that there was there. And this was a piece of research, piece of action research, which said we're going to break the cycle of poverty. We're going to stop poor children getting poor education, leaving education early, entering the labour market early, getting low-paid jobs, starting families young, having children who will then follow that cycle. We're going to break that cycle by some timely and targeted interventions. Sadly, despite the best of those intentions, in 2016, Fergusley Park is still, by the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, the most deprived part of Scotland. Possibly not the most deprived part of the UK. Merthyr Tydfil may just pip it, but it's certainly a salutary lesson to those people who went in the 1970s and said to the people of Fergusley Park, we're here to help. And that's nothing against their intentions or their ambitions, but it is saying that there are limitations to what research can achieve. And in Mexico, there are various places that get studied and restudied and so on, and one of them is in Mexico. And Oscar Lewis remembers this episode when someone amongst the community said, many people have come here to study us, but not one of them has helped us. So I think a little bit of kind of humility and modesty when thinking about the answer to the question, what's going to follow from this for us, would be appropriate. Covert research is possibly the most controversial and challenging topic. So doing research without telling people that you're doing research. So you don't get consent, and the argument is it would be inappropriate to get consent because if you told these groups of people who are being studied that you were researching them, they would either politely decline or something worse would happen to you as a researcher. So examples would be people who've undertaken research on fringe religious groups and pretended to be true believers in that context. Or another study that's very interesting is David Calver's study of the nighttime economy and bouncers, where he took a job as a bouncer to study what it's like to be in that line of work, but he didn't tell people he was a sociologist, and lived to tell the tale, indeed. So there are all sorts of justifications that it's possible to give about keeping one's researcher identity secret. But there is a salutary tale. There are lots of examples where this has led researchers to do things that might be regarded as questionable. I'd be interested to get your take on this. So Lord Humphreys, that's Lord L-A-U-D, not Lord as in a member of the establishment, was an early career researcher in the United States at a time when gay sex was illegal. And he had an interesting research strategy. So he posed in men's public conveniences as a watch queen, in other words, the person that looks out in case the police or any other members of the authorities are coming. He watches out whilst consenting gay men engage in sexual relations. So far, so good. But when he was doing this, he also noted down the car number plates of the people who were frequenting these public conveniences. He then got in touch with an associate that he had in the police department and said, could you give me the names and addresses of these number plates, these car owners? Left a little while, grew his hair, got in touch with these people and said, I'm a very straightforward, ordinary researcher. I'd just like to ask you a few questions about, your life and members of your household and that sort of thing. And then put the two together. And with the result that what he was able to show was that the majority of the men whose car number plates he had collected were outwardly heterosexual. And his argument for doing this was that this helped to change opinion and move things towards liberalisation. But other people have said, well, that's an ethical question. Does the desirable end of liberalisation in relation to sexuality, does that justify the means and the deception involved in collecting material in this way? Some of you may have opinions. There's certainly a lot of literature on that topic. When research changes people is my 9th, so I'm getting towards the end. And so research can certainly change the climate of opinion, as Lord Humphreys' tea room trade did. But research can also change the lives of people. And here's a quote from Howard Becker, who I mentioned earlier, the author of Whose Side Are We On? This is another article of his, where he says that we should be careful about what we put into the public domain because it's very hard to know the consequences of putting things into the public domain. Certainly at the time, and even more so as an issue in terms of whether what people tell you in their teens and 20s, whether they're still happy for that to be in the public domain, whether they might regret as they're older having taken part and been a participant in a research project. And certainly there are cases of all sorts of research where people say, yeah, I think with hindsight, I wish I hadn't got involved in that particular study. An example of that is the 7-Up series, which I'm guessing quite a few people here know about the 7-Up series. Yes? Good. Maybe we can talk as well later. So for those who don't know, in 1964, a program went out of 7-year-olds, and it was young boys and girls, but also from different social classes. And these people were then followed at ages in 7-year gaps, so 14, 21, 28, 35, 42, 49, 56, and soon to be 63. Really interesting study, and there's a 7-year-old who I really identify with, who is asked by the researcher, do you think you'll go to university when you're older? And he says, what is a university? It was an unknown area. The researcher asks one of the better off children, and he says, yes, I'm going to go to Charterhouse in Cambridge. So there's that there. But I'm mentioning this here because at the bottom of the screen, there's a taxi driver, and he is a very engaging character. But in one of the middle episodes, he talks about having extramarital relationships. And that was really tough for his children. And in a later episode, he says, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have put that in the public domain. And indeed, maybe the people deciding what to include in the publication should have thought about that too. That's just one example, but there are lots of examples of things where what you tell other people and put into the public domain is a challenge when you think about the wider consequences. But the taxi drivers' children certainly were given a very hard time at school over that. Ethics committees. So I suppose my message here is twofold. One is that ethics committees are, as I guess everybody knows, controversial, and not everybody likes ethics committees. Some people are unremittingly hostile. Certainly there's a division of opinion, and some people say, well, they're narrowing the agenda for research, they're slowing things down, they're making everything bureaucratic. The case for them is that when research was unregulated, not everybody kept to the highest ethical standards. And I was saying to Tasha that some of you may have heard Rob Newman's radio programme earlier this week, where he talked about Cyril Burt and his what was discovered to be ethically dubious way of going about making up research findings. So my own view is that research ethics committees do play a useful role in preventing the worst cases, and back to the Bill Bryson point, once would be enough. Certainly there are many celebrated cases of breaches of research ethics in the history of research. But in addition to that, I would say that actually research ethics committees are forces for good, because they will also improve many research designs that come in front of them. They certainly cause people to give more thought to the sorts of issues we've been talking about here, because not all the ethical issues are immediately apparent. So there's an ongoing debate about this, and some people say, well, it's inappropriate in the social sciences. This has come in from medical research. If medical researchers want to have ethics committees for randomized controlled trials, then fine, but don't impose that on us. My own view is that actually ethics committees are open to people making the case for how they're going to grapple with research at all stages that's bringing up research questions. And if you've got ethics approval and if you've gone through the process, you'll have thought ahead about issues, including issues that reach publication. And I'm going to end, I'm sorry this is such a dark slide. This is one of my favourite book covers. I'll have to describe it to you. It looked fine on the screen. Anyway, Middletown is the city of Muncie, Indiana, which has been studied and restudied for nearly a century. But only in the 20th century did my good friend Eric Laster and his colleagues think that it was appropriate to include the city's African-American population amongst that study. So they called their study The Other Side of Middletown and focused entirely on African-Americans. And I've put the picture here. There is a wonderful picture at the bottom, so do look at the slides afterwards. I really love that bottom picture and did a talk about this in Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. And I said, I'd love to know what that girl has said to the one who's got that expression on her face. And someone in the audience put his hand up who worked for the university, and he said, oh, she's just said there's a rumor going around that faculty are going to get a raise. But I put it up here in this context because there was a lot of discussion about that top picture. Should it be included, and should it be included on the cover of a book, given that race in America is a tricky issue? And in the end, the processes were established through the collaborative arrangements that Eric and his team. This was a piece of research conducted largely by his students, by the way, and the photographs were taken by a photography major. But they'd gone through the ethics process, they were prepared for the questions, and so they had a process for arriving at a consensus that this was an appropriate picture to include on the book cover. Without ethics processes, that would have been a much more complicated process, and probably the picture wouldn't have been included on the cover. So I've just put the references that I've drawn on there, and I've gone on a little longer than I meant to, but I shall now stop and we'll have questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Graham. That was fascinating. I've certainly never worked in social sciences, and I haven't done much publishing work in social sciences, so that was a real eye-opener for me.
Did it make you want to?
A little bit.
Oh. I haven't put you off.
You haven't put me off, but I am very comfortable with microbiology at the moment. So we mentioned earlier, and it came up in your talk as well, about data and the reuse of data and the potential abuses of information that has been collected. With the current real push for open data, open science, open research, can you see future ethical issues arising out of the reuse of stored data? And how would you go about
Yes,
resolving
well, they're there
them?
already in a way, in that there are various repositories and archives and so on, and it's great that they're there. And I was saying over breakfast that I think it's such a real waste if data are collected and then just used by the researcher or research team that collects them, and then they're destroyed, or nothing more is done with them. But it is a challenge, because very often we're talking about pieces of research that were undertaken 30, 40, 50 years ago, when consent forms weren't really, well, I'm sure they've been heard of, but they weren't routine. So Ray Powell's study on Sheppey, for example, all that material is archived in the University of Essex, but you won't find a consent form amongst all the archived materials, and there's a lot of material there. So I think what we then have to do is to kind of impute what we think may be appropriate and maybe not. And then going forward, of course, feed this into, so one of my roles is to think about training of social science researchers, and to make sure that people have included in their training thinking about these kinds of issues, because it's very hard to go back to people and say, you took part in this research, and now we think we might like to do this additional stuff with your data. Now, it is possible to trace people, and in fact, there was a study conducted in the University of Leicester in the 1960s, where all the archived material remained. It was about transition from school to work. And John Goodwin and Henrietta O'Connor were able to trace the majority of these 1960s teenagers in the 2000s, and to say, when you were in your teens, you talked about what you thought was going to be happening in your career and your life. Is that how it's turned out? And there's a fantastic book about that. So sometimes people will say, yes, that's fine. Almost all of them had forgotten that they're taking part in research. And you know, that's another kind of salutary point to remind ourselves that we may think that research is really, really important, but in people's lives, it's just another thing that happens if they take part in an interview or a focus group or whatever, and they're unlikely to remember that. So I think the answer to your question is that we are moving in the direction of it being seen as ethical, but also just sensible on a number of grounds, cost efficiency grounds as well, not to have data just accessible to one person. And then, of course, further there's the point about replication, because sometimes findings can be controversial. And where there's the possibility for a researcher to go back and say, I'm going to rerun the analysis of those data, then we can be more confident about the findings. But if someone says, well, you'll just have to take my word for it, that's what I found, then that's going to be an unresolved dispute.
I'm Tony Watkinson. As many of you know, I do research. I am technically an information scientist, but I'm not really. In the sense I was trained as a historian, I've been a publisher most of my life. I learned from Nelly, as it were. Okay, but I came across an interesting piece of a problem which I never envisaged, in that we were interviewing for a particular project a lot of researchers, and we made it clear we were going to send back the information. We wrote up the research, the interview, then we sent it back to them for approval, whether it's correct. And I got an anguished communication from somebody who works on privacy in a large West Coast, very large West Coast company. he said you should never send anything like that through email.
Oh, right.
Now, I must say, I send things through email. I know it's possible to get into email. I know I've been hacked and so forth, but how does life continue otherwise? And he couldn't think of an alternative, which is really convenient, actually, for us. So now what would you... Have you come across something like this? He had to drop out of the study. I wasn't going to give up.
No, I mean, that question could have gone in a number of different directions as to why that's seen as a problematic process. I thought you were going to say... and then the people said, I never said that, or I want 3/4 of this withdrawn. So lots of that happens. I haven't come across that as an issue. I mean, this may not be a sustainable position to take, but I'm just thinking it would be more expensive, but it would be more secure to print things out and send it by secure mail, wouldn't it? So that's one thing. I guess it would depend on who the research group are. So there are going to be some research participants who are very tech savvy and who'll be fine with encryption and those sorts of things. And there are going to be other groups of people who, if my mum had been one of your participants, then she and computers have yet to meet. So so I think it's partly going to depend on your group, but I haven't come across it. But it's perhaps a good example of how, unless we have these, so I shall take that away and feed that into to my training as an issue that needs to be, because somewhere amongst it's the thing about within a group, all it takes is one good person to have an idea that can then be the solution. But I don't know what that would be other than this very old tech one that is going to be costly and time consuming.
It's nice to produce a new thought for something distinguished.
Oh, it happens all the time.
So I'd like to follow up on that training point. So as publishers and particularly for those of us who work in societies, we are very aware that we have some level of responsibility for providing education and training to researchers. What kinds of materials do you think we should be looking to provide, and how do you think we could be working with the research community to do that more effectively?
Right. Well, I'm sure diversity is part of that, because one person's preferred medium is another person's anathema. So you mentioned that I'm part of the Economic and Social Research Council's National Centre for Research Methods, and we are always looking to sort of add to the resources that we have on our website and monitor usage. So it is surprising how many people do search for anonymity and confidentiality, which so we monitor these things, and they're generally sort of 3rd, 4th, and 5th or so in the top 100. There's one paper that is always top, which is how many qualitative interviews is enough? And that always wins every month. That comes out as the question that most people want answered, even though the answer is it depends. Sorry to give you a spoiler. But certainly putting those resources up, and I think what we're finding is again a point that's obvious, but nevertheless good to sort of just make explicit, about attention span. That things that are going to take a long time to engage with. So long 1-hour lectures, people aren't going to, so bite-sized things, maybe with some visuals, and I guess as well. I mean, I think the papers that we find get used a lot do have anonymity and confidentiality in the title, and so it's that thing about it's not really being that smart to sort of say, what will people be searching for? Let's put that in our title. But, fortunately for us, other people haven't kind of cottoned onto that. And then in training, I mean, a lot gets said in relation to ethics about how it's a process and not a one-off event. So I think fitting into the kind of the monitoring of research, whether it be for students who are training, but for all research processes, to have kind of like periodic reflection on what's going on. And I was mentioning the European Research Council ethics process, and very often what we do there is to say, we're happy to approve this project, but we think there should be an ethics committee, and we think the ethics committee should meet once a year, and the issues that are coming up or that are anticipated be included there. So I think some sort of training about not just the research process, but also the evaluation process and the monitoring process would be useful. But I'm sure, you know, it's such a rapidly changing field that I'm sure I'm missing a whole bunch of things about, you know, kind of internet chat groups and things like that, because there is the view of the flipped classroom that actually, you know, the best learning happens when the agenda is set by the learners rather than professors in their 60s.
I was wondering if you have any specific advice to social science publishers about what they should be doing to try and help improve research ethics.
Specific. I mean, as a generality, I suppose, encourage space for people to provide an account and an audit trail. So I'm of a generation that grew up on books, but also articles, where there was a fairly full account. Quite often, you know, the questionnaire, or if it was a survey, or the questions would be included as appendices. And I think that's one of the things that sort of shrunk over time. So I think that's probably fitting in with the trend anyway towards kind of encouragement or pressure on publishers to allow research to be replicable and reproducible. And that can't happen unless somehow the ways the original researchers went about doing things can be done. So no, that doesn't have, I mean, that can make for very thick books if we're talking about books. So it may well be sort of working hand in hand with the archiving process, but I'm sure that's an important part of just getting people to think. And then also to encourage kind of honesty. And I'm not here saying there should be lots more articles on reflexivity. I'm sure the people who write articles about, I did this research, and I'd just like to tell you how reflexive I was. I've read a lot of those, and they come across as a bit as if people have discovered this for the first time. So I'm not saying there's that, but that would necessarily be there. But kind of with new methods in particular, I think the rough edges take time to get worn off, and we get to think about. So I'm involved with a research methods journal, and I think that there's scope there for people to say, here's a new method, here's how it's working, and here's a useful trick. So I think sort of sharing within those kind of contexts can be helpful. But I'm aware that some of the things I'm suggesting are going to make editors frustrated by, say, but we're already really kind of stuck for space. You're wanting things to be longer. So it may well be working alongside depositories or whatever, so that people who want to go back, and I think that will also fit in with the education process, because, you know, research is incredibly expensive to do, and the Economic and Research Council, and probably the others as well, I'm not sure, but I would guess they would, are saying, you know, it's such a waste that research materials are collected and then analysed only once. So certainly the ESRC is moving towards reanalysis of existing data. So publishers can play a part in that, I guess. I'm sure I'll have a better answer in an hour, but it will come to me.
Thanks. Martin Rickman from NDPI. And first, I've sailed all the way around the Isle of Sheppey, so maybe we can talk afterwards. But I was just... You
weren't the person that thought you were going from London to Southampton and was told to keep the coast on your right-hand side, were you? Because
no, that
would be very bold of you to admit that. But it wasn't you. Okay.
No, I was just wondering whether you could maybe talk a little bit more about a couple of the examples that you gave near the beginning. For example, the town that was it Springvale or something?
Springdale, yep.
And also the Isle of Sheppey example, where you kind of said, well, the research was published and someone took offence to the research.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering where exactly. I mean, there's a lot of research which can come across as offensive, and it's, you know, it's simply stating some facts. I'm just wondering where exactly you see the ethical problems there, and where we as publishers should be kind of looking for red flags, and whether there's something that we can specifically say, no, this is where we should draw the line on these kind of publications.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Springdale, the offence was so great that nobody has ever gone back there to research again. Sort of, that research was done before I was born. So that's how long it's been a kind of no-go area for researchers, because people just don't trust researchers. So I think there is an issue about queering the pitch for future generations, which is an ethical one. And there may be something particular about places, because researching groups may be more, groups that aren't place specific may be more easy to anonymize and disguise and give pseudonyms and so on. Yeah, the guidelines for that. I mean, some people get round that by not just giving pseudonyms, but altering some of the characteristics. So, and I mean, that's not the biggest ethical sin in the world, but I think there's a loss of, the more you disguise something, the more you lose the specificity. And Ray Powell did for a long time not say where the Isle of Sheppey research was, but it was so apparent just by saying, oh, this is an island in the Thames estuary. That narrows it down to about 4, and it's a place that used to have a steelworks. That narrows it down to 1, and so I think disguising that, you would lose something. And his take on it was that as long as the individuals were not identifiable, then it was okay to identify the place. But I think having gone back to Sheppey and done a partial restudy of that, we found it much easier because we did have a brilliant partner organisation to work with who just were kind of like our eyes and ears, and they would say, don't say that, Graham. Or maybe put that a different way before it was out into the public domain. So I think some sort of working with local groups would have stopped Ray from putting things out there like that. And I mean, I guess it's difficult to have a hard and fast answer because we're talking about degrees of risk. And one of the issues that those cases and other cases are raising is, of course, that you can disguise something to outsiders, but if people on Sheppey know that Ray Powell and his team have been there for 10 years, they're going to know that it's Sheppey, and they're going to be quite quickly able to kind of identify. And there is a study that was done in Banbury in the 1950s, where the book was put into the local public library, and when they went back and did a restudy, the researchers found that this book had been annotated. So they'd used pseudonyms, but people had put in the margins, that's Mrs. Smith or that's Mr. Jones or whatever. And they weren't necessarily correct, so I think there's a real tension there about kind of wanting to talk to a general audience, but knowing that there are some people who have inside information. And that applies as well in sort of family research as well, where, generally people aren't identifiable, but if you know that a member of your family has been part of a project, and then that project is written up, even if people are anonymized, even if there are sort of slight variations introduced to some of the facts, nevertheless, it can put into the public domain things that are difficult. And, and sometimes that has real consequences. I didn't mention it, but there was a famous study in the 1960s of married couples and how they handled difficulties. And the divorce rate amongst that sample after the book was published was a salutary kind of lesson. It didn't necessarily do the people who took part in that research good, depending on your view on divorce and all those. Some people may say, well, they would have got divorced anyway. But I think what it did was to kind of crystallize, the difficulties. And as I say, some people went their separate ways as a result of reading the book about the project that they're taking part in. So I guess, I guess it's to approach it as a kind of what's an appropriate risk to take. It would be a shame if everything became so bland and standardized that there were completely no risk, because then you'd lose a lot of the point of doing the research in the first place.